I found my corner in this small house on the outskirts of the city. My sanctuary, a place where time could slow down and I could escape from the world's chaos. Here, in the quiet, I tried to heal, piecing together my thoughts and feelings like shards of broken glass. The morning light streaming through the windows and the smell of freshly baked bread always wafting from the oven became my symbols of peace and small happiness. These simple comforts were all I needed. The world outside could fade away, and I could just breathe, without the weight of obligations, without the noise of life demanding too much from me. But then everything changed in an instant, with a soft knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. It had been years since anyone had come to visit me here. My life had become quiet and routine, and I'd come to treasure that simplicity. Yet there was something about the knock that stirred something inside me. It wasn't a normal knock, but a hesitant one, as though the person on the other side was unsure whether they belonged here too. I stood still for a moment, staring at the door. Who could it be? I didn't have many visitors, and certainly not ones who knocked like that. Slow, deliberate, as if testing the boundaries of something. My heart fluttered uneasily in my chest, but I couldn't bring myself to ignore it. The knock came again, this time louder, more insistent. I opened the door, and there he was. Jake, my stepbrother. It had been years since I had last seen him, and in that moment, he looked nothing like the young man I remembered. His face was harder, more worn, and his eyes, those eyes that used to shine with openness, now seemed clouded, distant. A lifetime of unspoken words and unresolved things seemed to hang between us. His voice, when he spoke, was flat, carrying a tone I couldn't place. "I just thought I'd stop by for a few days, get away from everything," he said, but there was something in the way he spoke that made me wonder if he was telling the truth. I didn't know why he had come. Why now? After all these years of silence, when my life had finally found its quiet rhythm, when I had just begun to feel at peace with myself. His visit felt like an interruption, a disruption I wasn't sure I was ready for. But he was here. And for some reason, I couldn't bring myself to ask him to leave. So I stepped aside to let him in, and as he crossed the threshold, I couldn't shake the feeling that this visit was going to change everything. Jake stepped into the house, his movements stiff, like he was unsure of where he was and how to act. The once familiar space now seemed alien to him, and I couldn't help but notice the way he avoided making eye contact with anything for too long, almost as if he was afraid that if he did, something would be revealed, something that neither of us was ready to confront. The silence between us stretched out awkwardly as I led him into the living room. He glanced around quickly, his gaze flicking to the old photos on the walls, to the worn furniture that had once held so many memories. The house felt so small in comparison to how I remembered it from when we were kids. I wondered if it felt the same to him. "You still have all this stuff," he remarked quietly, his voice carrying a trace of something I couldn't quite identify. Nostalgia? Regret? I couldn't tell. I nodded, unsure of what to say. The room seemed colder now, even though the fire crackled softly in the hearth. His presence, though familiar, felt like a stranger's. The space that used to feel like home now felt invaded, tainted by the weight of unspoken words and unresolved histories. Dinner was the next obstacle. We sat at the table, the clinking of silverware the only sound filling the silence between us. I tried to keep the conversation going, asking about his life, his work, anything to break the tension, but his answers were brief, clipped. It was as though he was here physically but emotionally distant. Every time I tried to probe further to reach him, he shifted uncomfortably, changing the subject or offering a vague excuse. His eyes, though, told a different story. Every so often they would flicker to me, and I caught a glimpse of something behind them, something raw, something painful. But before I could register it, the look would vanish, replaced by the cool, controlled mask he had perfected over the years. I could feel the distance growing between us, and yet there was an undeniable pull, a strange, almost magnetic tension in the air. It was like we were two strangers, orbiting each other, and the more we tried to ignore it, the more palpable it became. He seemed torn between wanting to talk and being terrified of what might come out if he did. And me? I wasn't sure if I wanted to know. By the time we finished dinner, the night felt heavier than it should have. I stood to clear the dishes, trying to ignore the way his eyes lingered on me, on the quiet, almost painful way I moved through the house. He was watching me, and it felt like he was searching for something. But what, exactly? I couldn't tell. And that's when I noticed it, his hand, just barely brushing against mine as I passed him the last dish. It was a fleeting moment, hardly a touch, but in that instant the air seemed to thicken. I froze, my heart suddenly racing in my chest, and for a moment we both just stood there, staring at each other, unable to move. The silence between us grew suffocating, and then, as if nothing had happened, he quickly pulled his hand back, his expression unreadable. What was that? I couldn't wrap my mind around it. The tension was still there, hanging between us, but now it felt different, more electric, more charged. The rest of the night passed in uneasy quiet, both of us retreating into our separate spaces. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted between us, and I wasn't sure if it was something I wanted to understand, or if I even could. The next day, Jake continued to wander through the house, his movements slow and deliberate, like he was searching for something in the old photographs on the shelves. His fingers lingered on the frames, as if he was looking for a connection to a past that no longer seemed familiar to him. I watched him from the doorway, wondering why he seemed so lost in my world. Our world. It was like he didn't belong here anymore. When I tried to speak to him, the conversations were scattered, disjointed. He was polite but distant, avoiding anything too personal. Every time I tried to ask about his life, he would either brush it off or change the subject. Something was off, and I couldn't figure out what. His visit felt like more than just a simple stopover. There were layers to his silence, things he wasn't saying, and I couldn't shake the feeling that he was here for a reason I wasn't privy to. As the day wore on, the tension built, thick and heavy. I could feel the walls closing in, but no one said a word about it. We went for a walk later that afternoon. There was no conversation, just the sound of our footsteps on the gravel path. The air felt heavy with things unsaid, a strange distance that neither of us could cross, even as we walked side by side. And then, unexpectedly, his hand brushed mine. It was barely a touch, so quick that I wondered if I had imagined it. But no, I could still feel the warmth of his skin lingering on mine, and in that moment, everything changed. There was something between us now, something invisible, electric. It made my heart race and my thoughts scatter. I wanted to pull away, but I didn't. Neither of us said anything, but the brief contact had spoken volumes. The space between us had shifted, and I wasn't sure if I wanted it to go back to how it had been before. We continued walking, but the air felt different now. Every step was filled with a tension I couldn't ignore, and I knew things would never be the same. We stopped by the old stone bench near the edge of the woods, the place where we used to sit as kids, talking about everything and nothing. But today, the silence felt suffocating. My thoughts were tangled, and I could feel the weight of everything unsaid between us. Jake stood beside me, his presence almost overwhelming now. His eyes lingered on me, the look in them something I couldn't understand. He was struggling, I could see it, and I couldn't tell if it was just the situation, or if it was something deeper, something I wasn't ready to face. Without warning, he stepped closer. His breath caught in his throat, and before I could process what was happening, his lips were on mine. It was brief, hesitant, but it felt like a wave crashing over me. I froze, every part of me screaming to pull away, but I didn't. I couldn't. The kiss wasn't just a physical thing, it was loaded with everything we'd been avoiding, every unspoken feeling that had been building between us. We pulled away slowly, both of us stunned by the moment. I felt dizzy, my head spinning with confusion and something else, something I couldn't identify. Jake's eyes were wide, his face a mix of regret and uncertainty. We didn't speak. The kiss had changed everything, and neither of us was ready to acknowledge what it meant. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we had crossed a line, one that could never be uncrossed. The days after the kiss were filled with a strange, suffocating silence. We both pretended nothing had changed, but the air between us was thick with the weight of it. Every time I looked at Jake, I saw the turmoil in his eyes that avoided meeting mine for too long, as if he feared what he might reveal if he did. Finally, one evening, when the tension in the house was unbearable, he spoke. We were sitting in the kitchen, the only light coming from the dim glow of the stove. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if he were sharing something he hadn't even told himself yet. "I didn't come here just to visit," he said, his hands gripping the edge of the table. I don't know what I'm doing. I thought I could find something here. Some answer, some peace, but I can't seem to escape what I'm running from." He looked away, unable to continue, but his words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. I could see the pain in him now, something raw and deep that he had been hiding for so long. He was lost, not just in his life, but in himself. His confession hit me harder than I expected. I had known something was wrong, but hearing him say it out loud made it real. I wanted to reach out to him, to offer comfort, but I was afraid of what that might mean now, especially after everything that had already happened between us. Jake exhaled slowly, his gaze still averted. "I'm sorry," he added quietly, as if the apology was meant for more than just the confession. It was for the kiss. It was for everything. I didn't know what to say. I was torn between wanting to help him and needing to protect myself from whatever this new dynamic between us was becoming. But in that moment, I understood. He wasn't just here for a visit, he was here because he was lost, and he was looking for something to hold on to. And somehow, I had become part of that search. The days passed in a blur after Jake's revelation. The weight between us had shifted once more, but now it was more about understanding than confusion. He had finally allowed himself to be vulnerable, to acknowledge the pain he'd been carrying for so long, and I had done the same in my own way. I had opened up to the complexity of our situation, allowing the discomfort to exist without pretending it could be erased. We spent our final hours together in a kind of quiet reconciliation, as though we were trying to make peace with everything that had transpired. It was clear Jake was ready to leave, but the atmosphere between us was different now, calmer, yet still fragile. As we stood by the door, preparing for his departure, I could see the change in him. His shoulders seemed less burdened, his steps lighter. The tension that had once dominated his every movement had eased, and for the first time in days, I saw a glimpse of the man he used to be, the one I remembered from our childhood. "You'll be okay," I said softly, more to myself than to him. He smiled faintly, and for a brief moment, our eyes met, no longer filled with uncertainty or confusion, but with something else. Understanding. A shared acknowledgement of the past, of everything that had happened, and of the possibility of something different in the future. "I'll be back," Jake promised, his voice steady. There was no longer hesitation in it. I nodded, unable to speak the words, but knowing that I believed him. He would return, and when he did, we would both be different, shaped by the time apart and the experiences we had shared. Whatever had unfolded between us, whatever boundaries we had crossed, would not be forgotten. It would linger, a part of our story. As Jake stepped out of the door, I felt a shift in the air, a subtle transformation. The house, which had once felt like my solitary refuge, now felt full of the complexities of our past, the fragile hope of our future, and the connection that had grown between us, despite everything. I stood there for a long moment, watching as he drove away, but this time, there was no sense of finality, only the quiet certainty that everything had changed, and that, in time, we would both find our way. As the days turned into weeks, I slowly returned to my quiet rhythm, the solitude I had once craved now somehow different. The house felt fuller, but not in the way it had before Jake's arrival, more like it had become a place where the past and future existed in quiet tension, quietly shaping the present. Jake's promise echoed in my mind. "I'll be back." I wasn't sure when or how that would happen, but I knew he would keep his word. There was no longer the same distance between us, no longer the uncertainty that had clouded my thoughts. Even though we hadn't spoken in depth about what had happened, about the kiss, about everything that changed in those few days, it didn't matter. The bond between us had shifted into something deeper, something unspoken yet understood. The house, my sanctuary, had transformed. It wasn't just my place of refuge anymore. It was a space where the complexities of life and the messiness of relationships had found a home. I no longer felt like I was hiding from the world. I was living within it, with all its contradictions, its silence, and its connections. I thought of Jake often, of the man he had been when he arrived, full of questions and pain, and the man he had become, lighter and more open. I wondered what he was doing now, where his journey would take him, and what had changed inside him since he left. But more than anything, I knew that whatever it was, we were no longer the same people. Our bond, fragile as it was, had become something that would outlast the awkwardness, the silence, and the distance. It wasn't about what had happened between us. It was about what had shifted inside us both, about the understanding that had emerged from the tension, the discomfort, the unanswered questions. And that, I realized, was the most powerful thing of all. Weeks passed, and life resumed its familiar cadence. But things were different now. I had found something I hadn't expected during Jake's visit, an understanding of myself, of what it meant to connect with someone, and how sometimes the silence and space between people could reveal more than words ever could. The house had settled into its new reality. There were no longer moments of eerie quietness or restless uncertainty. My thoughts were less cluttered, clearer than they had been before. But I couldn't entirely shake the feeling that something more was out there waiting for me, waiting for both of us. Jake had left, but a part of him remained. It wasn't just the promise of his return, though that was comforting. It was the understanding that we had both been on separate journeys that had now intertwined in a way neither of us had expected, and that change, however subtle it was, had left a mark on me. I began to think more about what I wanted. I wasn't sure where my path was leading, but I knew that it wasn't going to be the same path I had once walked. It was like my life had turned a corner, and although I didn't know exactly where it would go, I knew it would be different. One afternoon, a few months after Jake had left, I received a letter from him. It wasn't long, just a few brief lines on a simple sheet of paper, but it felt like a door opening between us again. He wrote about the things he was discovering about himself, about the changes he had made, and how he was slowly rebuilding the pieces of his life. It was strange, reading his words. I hadn't realized how much I had missed his voice, how much I had missed the raw honesty that seemed to slip out of him when he least expected it. But the letter wasn't just about his life. It was also about us, about the bond we had shared and the way it had evolved into something more. The kiss, the tension. It was no longer something we needed to hide or deny. It had become a part of our history, but not the thing that defined us. As I folded the letter and set it down on the kitchen table, I realized something important. I wasn't waiting anymore, not for him, not for the answers. The silence, the unresolved feelings, they were part of a chapter that had ended, but not in a way that felt final. It was like the closing of one door, but the opening of another, and what lay beyond it was still unknown. I could feel the shift within me, a quiet strength that had come from all the moments I had spent reflecting, questioning, and growing. I was ready for what came next, whatever it might be. Jake had taught me something, even without meaning to, that sometimes we have to walk through the discomfort, through the uncertainty, to find clarity, and when we do, we realize that everything we've experienced, no matter how painful or awkward, is just another part of becoming who we're meant to be, and maybe, just maybe, that meant that the next time we crossed paths, we wouldn't be strangers anymore.